Okay, so tonight we're going to be dealing with sector regimes, regulatory regimes. So we're going to go through that after we've done the introductory part of the lecture. So let's turn to that. But firstly, midterm exams. So everybody wrote the midterm exam last week. Most of you did very, very well. It was out of 60, 3 of you actually got 58, which is awfully close to perfect, so good for you. The class average was just over 48, which is 82%. So that's excellent. You know, that's a really excellent midterm result. So I'm really pleased. It will be the same format, absolutely, for the final exam. There will be 100 to 120 questions. I haven't set the exam yet, but it'll be exactly the same kind of thing: true or false, or multiple choice, and open book. All right. Before we move on, does anybody have any questions about the midterm exam? Anything at all? All right. Okay, so I posted a couple of videos for you yesterday on Moodle for consideration for tonight's class to talk about it. So basically, there was 2 videos I posted for you. One was a documentary on Chernobyl, which was a monumental basically nuclear breakdown of a plant in 1976, right, in Russia. It would have been the Soviet Union back then. And the second one I posted for you was it was an agenda by Steve Paikin. It was a discussion on the Ring of Fire, which is a phenomenally resource-rich and potentially very, very valuable mineral deposit in northern Ontario, about 500 clicks north of Thunder Bay. So those are the 2 videos I posted for anybody to have any comments on to start the class off, to obviously go towards participation. So does anybody have anything you want to say about either one of those particular videos?
Hey, sir, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Hi. Yeah, I watched the both of the videos, and the one thing that I found really fascinating about the Ring of Fire, they had nothing to say. The First Nation chief of the St. Martin's First Nation, he had nothing to say about the environment. He had nothing to say about them as extracting the minerals out of the ground, and you know what that's doing to the planet, and the effects on the community and things like that. All his concerns seem to be focused on the economic benefits of the mining and the road going through, and that kind of doesn't that go against, like, I thought most First Nations people were about Mother Earth and protecting it, and you know, I thought that their fight all this time had been about that, not about jobs and money.
Well, you're in the right direction, but we talked about this last week as well when we talked about pipelines and how pipelines mostly from northern Alberta through to the Pacific Ocean, pass through a number of territories for First Nations and Indigenous peoples that aren't even First Nation but have their own territory. And there are a great number of First Nations that have signed on to pipeline development for economic advantage. What we saw in the Ring of Fire video with Chief Bruce, and I can't pronounce his last name, at St. Martin's First Nation, you're absolutely right. His focus was poverty, the abject poverty that his First Nation faces. And as a function of that, obviously, they see, coming out of that poverty as, a prime motivator for participating in the development of the Ring of Fire. So you're right. I mean, it is inherent in Indigenous philosophy and culture to rely upon Mother Earth and to center themselves around the Earth and its safekeeping.
Well, you know what I don't understand, sir, is, sorry for interrupting, but you know, out west, the First Nations that have their First Nations running across the pipeline with the oil in it, I know a lot of those guys get, they call them personal cash distributions from the First Nation, which is paid for by, say, the big oil companies like Shell or whoever. Anyway, they get these, like, these $5,000 a month payments, just personal cash distributions, or distribution payments or whatever you call them, and it's part of their accommodation and consultation process, right? So I don't understand, why can't they do that process here? And along with that accommodation factor, why don't they say, if you're gonna do this, you create jobs. And I know a lot of First Nation people need the jobs, and I know a lot of them don't have a lot of education. A lot of them up there don't go to university because it's so far away, and da da da. Anyway, neither here nor there. Why don't they get offered personal cash distribution payments as well, and put some of it back to the environment as
They,
well?
they do actually. It didn't come out in that interview. He wasn't a particularly well-spoken chief, but he's who's elected to the band council. So you have what you get. But all of the First Nations in the Ring of Fire, all of them had to negotiate an impact benefit agreement with Noront Resources, which is what Alan Coots was the other guy who's being interviewed. He's the CEO. Yeah, even though the chief of the Martins River or St. Martins, was talking about poverty, an impact benefit agreement that his First Nation would be negotiating, if they already haven't negotiated, with whatever resource development companies are there. They do take care of the environment. There's a set number of criteria that resource companies have to address in all impact benefit agreements when they deal with any territory that affects the First Nation. So even though he didn't speak about it in the piece, there would have been, and probably already has been, because it's been going on for at least 10 years now, there's already been a lot of negotiations to deal with the environment that's already gone into the prospective resource development in the Ring of Fire. So even though he didn't speak of it very well, it has been taken care of.
Oh, I see. You never hear about it. Like, I've been following this story for a long time, and you never hear anything about what they're doing and going to put back into the environment when they do all this mining and exploration. So
Yeah,
I never heard anything about it until now. So
yeah, and that's because it's because nothing happens, and resource companies don't enter into IBAs unless there is a large financial return, right? That's
mhm.
the reason they're there, and that's the reason why they enter into those agreements. And so all the attention of the Ring of Fire at this stage of the game has been on the potential financial resource recovery for Noront Resources and anybody else associated with the project from a resource point of view. So yeah, all the attention so far is being on money, because it's the money that everybody's focused on to ensure that it goes forward, right? But once it goes forward in a meaningful way, then all of the other collateral issues, including the environment, have to be taken care of as a function of the impact benefit agreements. So,
Well, how long has this been going on?
oh, it's going on for 10 or 12 years now.
Yeah.
And the former Liberal government in Ontario, Kathleen Wynne's government, had entered into regional agreements with the 9 First Nations that were going to be impacted by the development, which the Ford government rescinded pretty quickly once he came to power in
hmm
2018. Yeah, so now what the Ford government is doing is indicating that he wants to see Noront primarily enter into bilateral agreements with each First Nation, so not as a regional group. I don't know what
What do you think about that?
I don't know. I mean, the Noront didn't seem to think there was much of a problem with that. And Frank Yachibuchi, who was also on the panel in that video, who is a former justice of the Supreme Court, he didn't see a real problem with that either. His opinion was, and he was on a panel for the Ring of Fire public inquiry. He basically thinks that that everybody will treat it pretty much the same, whether it's a regional focus or a bilateral focus. So I honestly don't know what the benefit or the drawbacks would be in changing the mode of negotiation, from the group to the individual First Nations. So I don't know. But having said that, your questions are really good, because it really raises the issue of, is something like this, resource development, is it only about money? And you would think when you watch that clip that you would think that, yeah, it is, but there's a lot of other things, including education. Impact benefit agreements, have provisions for, again, environmental assessments, but they also provide education for the young people in First Nations, including scholarships to have them attend post-secondary education. ongoing promotion of their culture and funds for that. They often put money towards First Nations for the preservation of their language, right, which is a really big
Yeah.
deal, especially for the Ojibwe people.
See,
Uh,
those, sir, if I'm sorry for interrupting again, is what I find in mining communities, because I know there's a lot of them up and down the coast, and they open them and they close them every minute of the day, and they leave most places polluted, and they leave a lot of people. How do you say? Because most people in those communities are both dual incomes, so the husband and wife both work at the mine, and these guys are like they're making enormous amounts of money. And all you need is a grade 12. They'll train you. They'll give you everything, and then the mine pulls out and everybody suddenly doesn't have a job, and they start going bankrupt, and they lose their skidoos and their trucks, and they start losing things. And I just found, like Missinabbe's a good example. Renabbe gold mines, there used to be 1,000 people that lived up there, but and they put a school in there, and they put this and that in there. Now you go there, it's nothing but a fishing community, and they have Missinabbe Cree there as well. So like you can see, if you go up there, it looks like maybe, I don't know, 5 people have ever lived there, but it used to be a thriving community, and it used to, and now all those people don't live there, and it's the environmental disaster that they've left behind is terrible. Like nobody can live there for a certain amount of years. They had to fill in the mine, and they how do you say, when they put water in the mines when they close them up, so it's really not any land that anybody can use.
Miles, can I try in on this?
Sure.
I think to a response, personally, for someone who have worked in the mining industry myself, the cycle of mines has not changed for hundreds of years that we have been mining gold and other minerals. What have changed is the technique and how we have done it, and the environmental assessments and consideration that's been done. The mining landscape compared to 50 years ago today is different, and there's a lot of regulation that has to be followed when mines are being closed. But I would argue against certain environmental concern as to what's left after once we
No, I mean, the environment thing isn't my point. My point is that, these people say that they want jobs and they want education and they want this and that, but I don't think that they're really being realistic when it comes to concerns of future goals, like 25 years down the road when that mine closes and they have everybody there that works there, and nobody's going to have a job, nobody's going to have a house, nobody's going to have anything, and they're worse off then than they are right now.
No, I wouldn't think they're worse off then, because person enter these areas for the benefit that is offered. So someone goes in the mine, the gold, the deposit will run out. And sometimes persons, like in all times, we build towns around these industries. And as soon as these industries dies out, we move on. And it's just a natural cycle. It goes to individuals to how they manage the resource gain, how they manage the benefit, the money, the time. And sometimes these towns do strive on other industries that comes after the gold mine. But let's not put it in our head that the mine's going to last forever. All mines have shelf lives, right? And sometimes once the mine goes, the town goes, and that's just a natural cycle.
But that's what I'm saying. I'm saying it has a life expectancy. We know that it's not going to be there forever. We know this. Look around. It's history of repeating itself. But what I'm saying is these First Nation people aren't being realistic, because they're not saying, when this does end, what are we going to be when this is gone? Like, they don't seem to have a plan for the future after the mining is gone. What are they going to do for industry? What are they going to do? Because they're up in the middle of nowhere, just like Timmins. Timmins, when De Beers pulled out, go look at it now. You can get a house for 50 cents up there. 3 years ago, you can get a house up there for $500,000. And it's left poverty, and it's left despair and depression. And people need to be aware of this, and they should plan for that. They should plan for what if and what happens afterwards. And I don't see a lot of that. I just see, people wanting jobs and people just preparing for now. And I just don't think that First Nation peoples are preparing themselves for the fallout of what's going to happen when the mine does shut down again.
All right, that's good. All right, maybe we'll come back to that. We have some hands up, so I want to answer them. Georgia has her hand up.
Hi, yeah. My question was, when he said there's different pros and cons between it being bilateral and multilateral, I was just wondering what those are, and like who would be involved if it was done multilaterally?
Well, the multilateral arrangement was for the 9 First Nations to enter into one agreement with Noront Resources.
Okay.
All right, so they all entered an agreement together, and they referenced it in the film we watched. They called it dividing and conquering, which is what they were talking about in getting rid of that regional approach and having Noront negotiate directly with each First Nation. The argument against the bilateral approach was that they would divide and conquer each First Nation in that they could get a better deal, individually than they could with the group. But nobody, including the First Nation chief, Noront or Frank Yakabuchi, thought that would necessarily take place. They thought that there wouldn't be particularly a disadvantage to do it bilaterally.
Okay.
Okay. Shivani, did your hand up?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
What I would like to say is that I think the government was kind enough to incorporate like indigenous community into this project, because I think part of the video they said that they would be shareholders. I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong. But everyone's benefiting from this project, and it will improve their low economic standards. So I think this is a good idea. It was a good idea.
There absolutely will be shareholders. One of the advantages of impact benefit agreements is, in fact, to have profit sharing. So there will be a lot of funding that flows to each of these First Nations involved in Ring of Fire. So that's certainly part of that process. All right, you still have your hand up. Was that from before, or do you want to say something else?
No, I want to say something about the nuclear plant, but
okay. Well, we'll turn to the nuclear events in a second. Joy.
Right. But
I'm sorry, Rhett. Go ahead.
Yeah, as Shemane, I did mention just now that she's pleased to see the government including First Nations persons in the agreement. I think today the Ring of Fire delay is not just has not been slowed because of the agreement or a difficult agreement between First Nations and the resource company, but more of the environmental assessment that has been done over and over again, and many different regulations needs to be met. That's the last somewhat discussion I heard when I was following the story, that coupled with the different agreements between First Nations, who are also batting for the environment too, and their traditional lands, the environmental aspect and concern of it is sort of what a greater part of the delay as to why the project has not gone forward or gone further at this time.
Okay, Rhett, thank you. Joy?
Yes, can you hear me?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was, this one is regarding the one about Chernobyl. Just given the hindsight that we have now, just what would you say, in your opinion, was sort of the biggest downfall in how they handled the situation? Because I know there was sort of a lot of talk about how it took them sort of a long time to really be honest about the severity of things, which I find interesting, because it seems to be that there seems to be a trend with certain countries that sort of seem to be a little closed off, seemingly until it's too late. And so, yeah, I was just looking for your opinion there.
Oh yeah, that was the centerpiece of that documentary, was basically how it took almost a month before, it took a good number of weeks before the USSR announced to the public that what had happened, essentially. And actually, it took quite a while for whoever was running the plant to actually tell the government that the government, Gorbachev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union at the time, indicated he got notice of it from the Swedish government, saying, "Hey, we've got a lot of radioactive material in our atmosphere." So that was, so secrecy around it was a real problem. The other thing I thought was the most substantial issue was, how they exposed their own people to radioactivity as a function of the meltdown of the 4th reactor. They had 28 firemen go in right away, totally unprotected. And they knew at the time, how dangerous radioactive material is. It's the 1970s. It had been around actively for at least a couple of decades. So, and then even going forward, the number, there was 500,000 Soviet citizens who were involved totally in the cleanup of this disaster, and their representation to the public as to how many people actually died from it and or were caused with life-changing diseases, cancer more likely than not. The fact that the government still downplays the damage caused to the citizens is pretty outrageous. So that's what I took from that to a great degree. Valerie?
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I'm using a new headset. I guess my question was along the Chernobyl frame as well. If we know that this has happened, we know the dangers of it, why are we still using the radioactive power energy? I'm sorry, my brain's tired.
Well, why are we still using nuclear power?
Yeah, why are we still using it if we know that this can happen? I mean, the effects that happened in this country should be an example. So what justifications do we have?
Well, we use it. It's still being used, and we still have CANDU reactors that are a big seller in Canada, nuclear reactors. The reason that we use it is because it is such an efficient generator of power. It's certainly cleaner than coal and oil in the immediate sense, but its waste is monumentally impossible to get rid of. But it's an economic thing. It's all it is. It's economics in that a nuclear power plant can service tens of hundreds of thousands of homes more efficiently than can any other source of energy. So there is no moratorium on having nuclear reactors providing power in the world, basically, because of money. Basically, everything is based on money in real terms when it comes to this kind of thing, and that's why we'll talk about it a little bit more when we get to the section in the lecture on nuclear power. But that's the thing, and they're still being used. They're still being used in Canada and in Ontario. So we'll talk about that some more as well. Lexine?
Yeah, definitely. One of the famous quotes as it relates to the environment, like old persons would know this quote, but it goes a bit like, it's not wise to fool Mother Earth. And while I was watching that document, I was like, why is it possible that persons are able to execute such an act like the decision makers? They made a decision and everything, and the impact was evident. So how is it possible that they will never, ever be held accountable for such actions as relates to the environment and everything?
You mean people like Mikhail Gorbachev in Russia, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're political. They're well, it's not a democracy in Russia, but I mean, the other places that the two other major nuclear meltdowns have been in Japan, which was only like 9 years ago, in the Fukushima in Japan, and that was a reactor meltdown, and then almost 40 years ago in New York State, 3 Mile Island. There was a reactor, it was a meltdown, and those, so Japan and the US are democracies. So they're politicians who are elected, and nobody builds these things expecting them to break down, right? And, ostensibly there's supposed to be any number of safeguards put in place so that if something goes wrong, that the damage is contained, and that's actually what happened. It happened relatively well in Fukushima. So nobody's going to be prosecuted for anything like that unless they knowingly allowed something to be built that was without regard to human safety, and so there's nothing to do other than elect them out of office. If they made bad decisions, they don't get reelected. That's how democracies work. But they don't make decisions that are criminal unless, of course, they knew that what they were building would, in fact, to a certainty, harm life. So it's a political science answer more than a law one, really. Anybody else? All right, Valerie, you still have your hands up? Are you
Okay.
sorry, Adam hasn't said anything. Adam's there.
Okay.
Adam? Yes, no? Arette, back to you.
Okay, I think the lessons coming out of Russia's disaster is that at the time that was the first disaster of its sort, and the world didn't imagine something like that. And what they did was basically fixing as they go along, making up solutions as they go along, because there was no playbook in dealing with such massive disaster. So I mean, hats off to those guys and the leaders who made those tough calls, sending men to the grave, right? It had to be done, necessarily had to be done. But fast track to where we are today, it's somewhat sad to see that we value the benefit so much that we take less proactive measures in our less aggressive stand in eliminating the use of nuclear power plants. As it mentioned in the film there, that there's been an increase in power plants and plans to make more because of the demand for energy. So I guess it's something that should definitely stick close to us, because at any time when one of these plants in our neighborhood, in our country, in our province, in our neighbor's place can, have a meltdown and affects us. So we, as we are today, we are not really immune from what's going on. And yet still there's no solution for it. The nuclear waste, they are still buried in mountains and underground. The nuclear waste from World War II, they are still around. It doesn't go away, like plastic, right? So that's something that we have to contend with in our generations to come. So it's a valid argument and discussion to have, I'd say.
Good, thanks, Red. Thanks, everybody. Anybody else, either on the Ring of Fire or nuclear disasters? We'll touch upon both of those briefly in the lecture itself. Any other comments? All right, guys, thank you very much. All right, that was good. I appreciate it. All right, so let's now go to the lecture. Okay, so tonight we're talking about sectoral regulatory regimes. Now, you remember at the last lecture we have not obviously the midterm, but the last Tuesday night, we talked about the 3 ways that regulations are put in place for the command and control toolbox that deals with basically putting laws, regulations in place to set standards for anything that affects the environment. Basically, that's the command toolbox, and then the control toolbox is putting in place the things like prosecutions or administrative monetary penalties, all those things we talked about, to in fact ensure that people live up to the rules and regulations that are put in place to protect the environment. And the 3 broad areas that these rules and regulations fall within, firstly was the media. So those are basically regulations aimed at things that affect the air, the water, or the land. Those are mediums, basically. They also talked about the approval schemes. So, there's a lot of energy put towards people who, in fact, companies, resource companies who apply to get things done, and they have to go through a rigorous approval process, a permit or license process to get the okay to get something done that will, basically, hopefully not adversely affect the environment. And the last one is what we're talking about tonight, the sectoral regulatory regimes, which is quite simply based on, rules and regulations focusing on individual sectors that have very specific environmental concerns that arise as a function of the individuality of each sector. All right, so we're going to go through 5 or 6 of these sectors in this lecture. I have a short video for almost all of them, so it's a little bit different than what I usually do, but because of the sectoral approach, the individual videos are a pretty good way to do this. Okay, so the first thing we deal with is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, everybody is familiar with. Fossil fuels, are oil and gas for the most part. Everybody recognizes that fossil fuels are still far and away the most common source of fuels worldwide, and as a function of that, and a source of fuels that causes a great deal of environmental harm. All right, so they're widely known, they're widely used, and the attention to the environment is also widely focused on how they're used. Environmental regulation occurs mostly at the provincial level. And that's because under the Constitution Act, Section 92, which deals with provincial powers, deals with natural resources. So that just happens to be one of those areas that the founding fathers back in 1864 said is that we will, as a province, have control over the resources essentially within our boundaries. The federal government, however, does have jurisdiction over oil and gas activities that cross boundaries, and hence, for instance, the participation of the federal government in its approval process for pipelines, right, which almost always cross boundaries. And in Canada, we have a number of boundaries. It crosses from Alberta to, to British Columbia, from Alberta down through the United States, from Alberta going east toward the Maritimes. All of these things fall within federal regulation because they cross boundaries. The federal government also has taken responsibility for anything to do with fossil fuels in the Arctic Circle, essentially. Right? They don't want to leave it to any individual territories that are up there, the Yukon, the Northwest, or Nunavut. Essentially, they leave it to the federal government because it's certainly better funded. And if you remember from a couple lectures ago, when we talked about the Arctic Circle, there are 5 or 6 nations in the Arctic Circle that are perpetually claiming jurisdiction up there, Russia being the most aggressive one. So when it comes to environmental concerns in the Arctic, it's better that the voice of Canada is the one that participates rather than an individual territorial voice, which is certainly not as well funded and or organized. Federal and provincial governments also have regulation with respect to the Atlantic offshore region, right? And this deals with, to a great degree, the Hibernia oil drilling site off of Newfoundland and Labrador, right? So while it gathers a great deal of resources for Newfoundland, because again, it is a natural resource, it's in international waters, and so it is something that the federal government has some jurisdiction over. Alberta, everybody would know this, Alberta is the largest producer of oil and gas in Canada. It has set up a very sophisticated regulatory system run by the Alberta Energy Regulator, right? So again, it's a regulatory body which puts in place a number of rules and regulations with respect to how hydrocarbons, which are emissions from oil and gas, are released into land, water, and the air, right? So this is this is the control toolbox of oil and gas. Basically, these regulations that deal with dispersal of hydrocarbons for the most part. British Columbia, Saskatchewan also have similar tribunals, but it's nothing of the size of Alberta. All right, so the first clip I'm going to have you watch, and you should be able to hear it. I think I've put on the proper button for that, are the issue of orphaned wells.
There's growing concern about the number of deserted oil and gas wells in Alberta and questions about who will pay to clean them up. The companies are supposed to foot the bill, but federal and provincial governments have spent millions of dollars decommissioning the sites, and they're not even close to fixing this multi-billion-dollar problem. Now, a CBC News investigation reveals the details of a new audit of the problem by Alberta's Auditor General. Anayat Singh is working on that story. So Anayat, why has the Auditor General stepped in?
So the Auditor General is looking into the issue of orphan wells. Orphan wells are oil and gas wells whose owners have gone bankrupt. So the companies that own these wells and were supposed to pay for cleaning them up are no longer operating. Now Alberta has 3,400 of these orphan wells currently, but the larger problem is the 94,000 inactive wells in Alberta. These are wells that are not producing right now, but are still owned by companies that are working. But the worry is that because of financial pressures on the oil industry and on oil companies, a lot of these wells are going to become orphaned. So the Auditor General is really looking at this looming problem and what can be done to tackle it. Now, a lot of these orphan wells are scattered around the province on the properties of rural landowners. And we spoke to one, Dwight Popovich. His land is about 100 kilometers outside Edmonton. And he is stuck with a well on his property. The company that owned it ceased operations in 2018. So let's take a listen.
Nobody in charge of this thing. We don't know if it's safe. We don't know if it's leaking. Nobody's showing up to even take a look at it. And it's been that way since Sequoia went under in March. of 2018, and we haven't seen anybody out here after when they came and locked everything up and walked away from it.
So now, who's supposed to pay to clean up all these wells?
So the industry operates on a polluter pays principle. So the idea is that the companies are responsible for eventually paying to clean up their oil wells. And the Alberta Energy Regulator has a system to ensure this. They look at the bottom line of companies that are permitted to drill wells to make sure that these companies can pay for cleaning up their wells. If the company's assets are too low, the regulator can ask these companies to put up a security deposit. The issue is that the regulator is using commodity prices from nearly 10 years ago to make this calculation. So they are in effect overinflating the assets of companies and not asking enough of them to put up a security deposit. So to give you an idea of this, the regulator has only collected $227 million of an estimated total environmental liability of $30 billion for all the oil and gas wells in the province. So there's a big gap there, and there's a worry that if more companies go under, the Canadian taxpayer would be responsible for picking up this bill because companies won't be able to pay for it. Now, on the other hand, the regulator can't just go and update their calculation and collect all this money now because companies are already under stress, and doing so might bring a lot more of them closer to bankruptcy. So there's a delicate balance there.
Interesting. So what's the Auditor General going to look at?
So the Auditor General is really looking at kind of this issue holistically. They are looking at the present, but they are concerned about the future as they see pressures on the oil industry and what can be done to tackle this. So we spoke to Val Mellis-Moen from the Alberta Auditor General's office to get an idea of the kind of questions they'll be asking. Let's take a listen.
Is the program designed to be able to handle an influx of additional abandoned sites? Can they manage this? What is the risk to Albertans in terms of financial, environmental, and public health and safety risks?
So the Auditor General is looking at the state of the industry. They're concerned about the pressure on oil companies, and they're really concerned about the future.
All right, and I thank you. And you can read its full investigation online.
All right, guys, so the point of that is, and then they gave you a number of 94,000 orphan wells. The point of that is that, all of these companies, and there's lots and lots of small oil and gas companies that come into existence because they think they can hit it rich and do very, very, very well. But, just like, it wasn't unlike what Michelle was talking about with mining, with mines closing down, Arette said the same thing. This is kind of the same thing in Alberta. These drilling sites, they close down. They close down because they're no longer productive, and chances are the company that was created for the purposes of doing this particular well digging or drilling has gone out of business, and therefore, if they're bankrupt, there's nobody who's responsible for them. And there's a number of issues. Obviously, first off, they're an eyesore, right? They're out in they're out in the fields, and they look like just what you see in these pictures at the bottom of the screen there. That's what they look like. They're sticking out. There's nothing pretty about these things. But more importantly, they're potentially dangerous. I mean, you don't know when something may go wrong, right? There may be some shift there may be some seismic activity in the area. There may be any number of things that could potentially, create some kind of release by the wells, and or something that will in fact harm the environment. And nobody is there to pick up the tab. And again, we just talked about it, the responsible party from a governmental point of view is the province of Alberta, right? It's not the federal government, because this doesn't deal with, oil going across, provincial or international boundaries. This is strictly within the province of Alberta. So it's a real problem, right? So it's something that has to be addressed and has to be addressed, hopefully in a reasonable fashion. And, clearly these days, with the price of oil being as low as it is, nobody is going to be contributing funds to, to some kind of a holistic resource protective environment for these kind of things when the price of oil is as low as it is. Okay. All right. Continuing with fossil fuels, we'll now turn to coal. We touched upon this last week. So coal is still, a incredibly important provider of heat, and as a fuel in this country. It's our energy in this country, 25 to 30% of it still comes from coal producing plants. And coal, as you can imagine, is a very dirty fuel, right? It's a lot of hydrocarbons from it, but it turns into coal dust and it goes into the environment. Both the federal and provincial governments have jurisdiction over coal, but again, not unlike oil and gas. The federalist jurisdiction is where there's international trade and commerce with coal and any issues dealing with interprovincial or international emissions from coal mines. Okay, so that's the breakdown of the jurisdiction. So again, it's something that has to be really taken care of when it comes to the environment. Provincial governments, they have the responsibility for exploration, development, and conservation relative to coal, right? These are the key bits of federal legislation that deal with fossil fuels. The Canada Energy Regulatory Act, which is basically doesn't apply where, for instance, Alberta Energy Act applies. So this is for federal cases. The Fisheries Act, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, the Migratory Birds Convention Act, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which we'll talk a lot about in the next couple of weeks, and the Impact Assessment Act, which we'll also talk about. But these are pieces of legislation that the federal government puts in place for those instances of fossil fuels and other kinds of fuels that have an interprovincial or international boundary issue attached to them and therefore fall within federal jurisdiction. Okay, nuclear energy. All right, so we already talked a lot about this, and and a lot of it came out in the documentary. But the debate over it, and this goes to one of the questions that was raised a few minutes ago. Why do we still have nuclear energy? Because we still have certainly issues around it. The financial cost of nuclear generated power, to build one of these plants is billions. I don't think it's trillions, but it's billions of dollars to build one. So you have to think, if you're going to spend that much money on building this kind of power, can it not be put to a better use? I mean, how many wind farms, for instance, can you build with the cost of one nuclear plant? And I would think it would be an extraordinary number. So that's part of a conversation that should take place, I would think. The risk of nuclear power, we know all about those now after watching Chernobyl. So, those risks are certainly there, even though that took place 35 years ago. Again, there was still a nuclear power breakdown in Japan less than 10 years ago. So these are things that we have to keep in mind. The long-term disposal of nuclear waste. Nuclear waste does not deteriorate for the most part. It's the half-life of nuclear waste is measured in hundreds of thousands of years. It's not like taking debris and taking it to a landfill site and having a bulldozer, bury it into a landfill site. So nuclear waste has to be disposed of in such a way that it cannot be exposed in any way whatsoever to the environment or anything, including people, because obviously of its risks, right? And then of course one of the things that you need to talk about is, as a function of nuclear energy, is the risk of nuclear weapons, right? So for instance, Iraq, right, and or Iran. It's always been an issue as to whether they should have nuclear power. The position they take is that they have nuclear power for the purposes of power generation, whereas most Western nations tend to think that the reason for the building of a nuclear power plant is not necessarily for power, but for weaponry, right? And that's a very geopolitical kind of question, but something that is always on people's minds. And there are very, very few nations that are nuclear powered nations, and there's a lot of them around the world nowadays that aren't now nuclear powers when it comes to having weaponry. Other concerns: location of nuclear power plants. So the biggest nuclear power plant we have in Ontario is just outside of Pickering, Ontario. It's called Darlington. So some of you may have seen it if you have driven along the 401 between Toronto going west to, for instance, Kingston. It's a little less than halfway of that distance, and it's very large. You can see it on the lakeshore of Lake Ontario. These plants are always built on or beside bodies of water. They use water for cooling down, purposes, and they use a lot of water for cooling down purposes. And again, that water, is treated and then put back out into the body that it came from. But it certainly, takes up a large area of land on the shore of Lake Ontario, in and around Pickering, Ontario, and people are nervous about that. I mean, I have a very good friend he passed away, but he lived for 30 years in Pickering, and people in Pickering, they know it's there. They recognize the utility of having it there. They know the good that nuclear power does generate, creates lots of jobs for people in the area. But they all have something in the back of their minds going, you know what, we live next to a nuclear power plant, right? So that gives them some concern on some, even if it's subliminal, basis, basically. Likewise, transporting radioactive fuel and waste, taking it anywhere other than from the plant site for disposal, right? Again, because it has a half-life of hundreds of thousands of years, is a dangerous proposition, right? It has to travel, and when it travels on roads, it's trucked, anything can happen. What if the truck is an accident? All kinds of things. So, these are concerns that really are fairly unique to nuclear power, right? There are a number of regulations for nuclear energy. Basically, they're international in nature because of the wide impact that nuclear power has around the world for both its beneficial use and its abuse, its negative use, basically. So there's a number of international agreements, most of them through the United Nations. We talked about this before, by virtue of treaties and or international covenants with respect to the use of nuclear power. Certainly there's agreements in place restricting nuclear proliferation amongst nations for weaponry purposes, right? Canada hasn't always agreed with the international treaties. There's a section on that in your textbook. We do have in place right now a $1 billion liability in place for nuclear power. So, and that was raised from a couple $100 million not that long ago, which simply means this: if Darlington, there's a meltdown, and all of the damage that would flow from that, to basically clearing out, the town or city of Pickering, people couldn't live there anymore, all those kind of things. The liability limit is the maximum amount of exposure that, in this case, would be the province of Ontario, would have as a function of that nuclear breakdown. And so, in fact, they're liable for $1 billion, and any damages over and above that is absorbed by whoever doesn't get paid. Everybody kind of understand that? Okay. Nuclear energy is a federal responsibility simply because it's seen to be an international issue, right? So you have the Nuclear Safety and Control Act that sets out the provisions that command compliance with how we look at nuclear safety. And then you have the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which controls the issues of compliance and regulatory regimes. Okay, mining and aggregates, right? Very, very big part of industry in Ontario. We have and Ring of Fire is an example of it. We have a lot of mining for both basically things that we see as minerals that have value, so copper and zinc and what have you, and aggregates, sand and gravel, and I'm going to see a video on that in a few seconds. So they have a lot of economic benefits. They're very, very useful. You need aggregates to make cement, to build buildings, all those kind of things. You need sand for all kinds of purposes, and then of course things like copper and minerals, for the purposes of electrical contracting and or any kinds of construction, are incredibly important. And and gravel being there to build roads. So and Ontario is very, very rich in mining and aggregates. It's provincially a jurisdiction that way. It's a natural resource kind of thing under Section 92 of the Constitution. So provinces have the greatest jurisdiction over mines in Canada and those kind of things, or in Ontario, except if mines are on federal lands. and with the one exception of uranium mines. And uranium mines, again, of course, are there for the purposes of nuclear power, right? So plutonium and uranium. So their federal jurisdiction, I can tell you from personal experience that uranium mining in Ontario has always been seen as a dangerous way to make a living. The largest uranium deposits in Ontario for a very long period of time was in the area of Bancroft, Ontario. That's Hastings County. So that's about 3 hours northeast of Toronto. So if you were to draw a line between Toronto and Ottawa, it'd be about 2/3 of the way towards Ottawa, you know, on that kind of a line. My mother's family is from Bancroft. And Bancroft has or had, the uranium mines have been closed now for probably 20 or 30 years. But you know, it has traditionally had the highest incidence of cancer per capita in the province of Ontario, right? And everybody in Bancroft, you know, takes it to be as a function of radiation from the uranium mining, right? Both my grandmother and my mother died of cancer. You know, they both grew up in Bancroft. So, and I have other family as well. So yeah, that's a very common thing. So even though the mines have been closed down for decades, you know, radiation doesn't dissipate to a great degree, right? Jurisdiction over pits and quarries is provincial, right? So this includes quarries where they mine sand, gravel, and crushed stone, fundamentally for construction purposes, basically. They're typically regulated basically under public statutes. The Ontario Aggregate Resources Act covers you know, those kind of things. Again, a very, very big business in Ontario. So what happens, for instance, in a sand or a gravel pit, they're open pit mining, so it's not like mines that you go underground with to a great degree. So what you're dealing with are areas, very large areas of land where if aggregates are plentiful, which is most of Ontario, they get a license from the provincial government to create a quarry, and then these very large trucks come in, these diggers and these trucks come in, and they start scraping off the surface, right? They scrape off the surface, goes into the trucks, it's trucked away to be processed, and that's all they do is dig and dig and fill trucks. The trucks go and other trucks come and fill the trucks, and the trucks go and other trucks come. You guys get the picture, right? So that's what they do. And once they've cleared out all of the area where they think that they have all the aggregate that's worth getting in that particular area, then they leave it, right? They leave it. They don't fill it in. It's far too huge to fill in. They simply leave it for the most part and then move on to another rich aggregate resource in the province, get another license for a new quarry, and start the process all over again. And this is happening all across the province all the time. Okay, here's a short video on a sand and gravel mine in Texas.
All of our roads are just falling apart. They kind of neglected them through the years, and it's just come up that they got to do it now. Last year, we did 300-something thousand tons. If all the work comes through, it's going to beat that this year. With our production and the new crusher that we bought, we felt like we had to have another screening plant. And we did want to go with the 205, the same one that we had, because we've had good luck out of it. My name's Charlie Harvey, work for Big Creek Sand and Gravel in Borger, Texas. We make B4, grade 3, B3, hot mix material. The main reason we bought this 3-deck 205s is there's so much work coming up in the Panhandle. We can't produce it all with one plant. We felt like if we bought another plant, opened up a different pit, we could crush mainly hot mix material here. But when we first got it, we thought we need to make a lot of A4 and A5 round material. With a 2-deck screening plant, we were kind of limited. We started crushing our concrete rock, so all of our B4 and our 5 turned out to be crushed. And a lot of people were wanting round material, so we felt like with the 3-deck 205 that we produced the round material that the people were wanting. With the 2512 that we're still running, it would about nearly double the capacity on it. where we screen about 1,000 tons, we get 15 to 1,600 ton a day out of the 205 in the right conditions. We did talk to a few other people, but it was mainly the Coburg people that we were visiting with. Texas Bearing that's right here local. Barry and them has been here to help us, so we just felt like we needed to stick with the Coburg Pioneer and the people here local that could help us. The unit we're standing behind now is the 2650 jaw crusher, pan feeder, the K300 cone crusher. It's got a 6x20 screen and the radial stackers. We're running the Vanguard jaw. You got a hydraulic adjust on it. It's so much easier. On our old crusher over there, you get ready to adjust your jaw, it takes you half a day. It's all manual adjust. This Vanguard jaw, you can come up and adjust it on the fly, no problem. You can just start your pump up, make your adjustment, and you're going within minutes. Production-wise, yes, that helps. Adjusting the jaw in a year's time, on the old plant, if you did it every time you needed to do it, you're going to wind up losing probably a couple, 200-300 tons a year in production. This one here, like I say, you can adjust it on the fly. You'll gain that back. You won't lose it, your production part. The K300 cone crusher, what's good about this one, it will give you your closed side setting. So you actually know where the cone is set at all times. This is so much more updated as well as letting you know where your closed side setting is. There's no guesswork at it while you're sitting there running. And like I say, we looked at some different units compared to this. And as far as the durability and stuff like that, I think we made the right decision. I said this on the 205 when we first bought it. Everything that we've got here is made in the United States of America. Some people don't think much about that, but I think a lot of it. You can send your money overseas, or you can keep it right here and keep the people in the United States working. We got prices and looked at the power screen unit, the Finleys and stuff like that, but we've had some good luck with Coburg Pioneer that we felt like being made in the United States. The people are right here to help you work on them. You don't have to get parts coming out from England or wherever they come from. It just takes a while. And if you're down, downtime costs you money. We get them right here locally. It just fits better in the Texas Panhandle for us. I guess I've known Barry for about 35, 36 years. And out of those 35 or 36 years, he never let me down. Texas Bearing was there when we needed it. It's like anything else. When you do business with people that you can trust and that you know that they're going to take care of you, you're going to do business with those people. Same way with Coburg Pioneer. If they told us they were going to do something, they did it. Anytime we needed something, they were right there to help us do it.
Okay, so apart from the Made in America kind of thing, that you have the political horror, the political thing. Anyway, the reason I gave that one to you is I just wanted you to see the size of the machinery that goes into this particular business. So again, and that there's no reason to think that we don't have the same kind of machinery in Ontario. That that's what's doing damage, to the landscape of Ontario soils and gravels. So and it's a very continuous kind of thing happening. All right, guys. Next, fisheries. So fisheries are fundamentally fall within the federal jurisdiction. We're talking the Fisheries and Oceans Act for the most part, which also interplays with international relations, because when you're dealing with fisheries and you're dealing with them in international waters, particularly, then you're going to come into contact with other countries, other states that are trying to do the same thing you are, which is fish, basically. There are obviously provinces that have concerns in that regard. A lot of them that deal with large fishing is obviously coastal provinces like British Columbia and the Maritimes, Newfoundland and Labrador and what have you, basically. So the Fisheries Act is the fundamental piece of legislation that governs fisheries in Canada. So it applies to all waters that are international, which is territorial, and internal waters of Canada that have fisheries, basically. The Fisheries Act has a regime in place that is the control part of the toolbox that has a fair bit of protection and prosecution built into it to protect the habitat and to protect species. basically. You also have some provincial legislation that deals with fisheries, but that largely deals with licensing and management. And the much smaller scale of fishing, which is part of fisheries. When it comes to fishing, as in, you go on the weekend to fish in a lake. It could be Superior, or it could be any internal lake. Provinces have jurisdiction in that regard, and you need licenses from the Ministry of Natural Resources to fish the particular species, to fish during the proper season. All of those things are in place to ensure the sustainability of the fish stock. And we talked a bit about this earlier. There are exemptions for that for Indigenous peoples who, while they still have to, conform to some parts of the regulations in that they have to disclose their quota and what have you. Indigenous peoples, for instance, don't have to abide by seasons, so they can fish wherever they want at any time of the year without a license in that regard. Okay, this is a video on cod fishing in Newfoundland and Labrador. This was the heartbeat of the economy in Newfoundland 25 years ago, and it was, incredibly and abruptly, it came to a halt when the federal government put a moratorium on cod fishing in order to save the species. So that's what this, that's the premise behind this particular video.
Morning in Lassie, a new day of fishing on the horizon. Brad Watkins and the crew of the Newfoundland Mariner got in last night to unload a catch of crab. A disappointing haul, but what Watkins really wants to fish is cod with his new hook and line system.
This boat was going to be rigged with 20,000 hooks. We can shoot them in 2 hours, low labor intensive compared to gill nets and what have you, and the quality is top notch.
The system was intended for his old boat, the Atlantic Charger. But in 2015, while Watkins was ashore buying the gear, his crew had a catastrophe at sea. They survived, but the Atlantic Charger was lost. Watkins' insurance paid out big. He could have taken the cash and walked away from the fishery for good. Instead, he bought back in.
So it's unfinished business for me. It's like the gear that I'm going to be putting on this boat, still in crates. A lot of money, a lot of investing, and a lot of deals done. And Mother Nature put me on hold, and I just felt like I had to get back at it and finish off what I started.
Now, the province's cod fishery may also be getting a second chance. Cod stocks are at their highest levels since the moratorium began 25 years ago. It's still a long way from a commercial fishery, but Watkins says if cod does come back, we need a new way to catch it.
There's not so many fish in the ocean, so we got to capitalize and try to get the dollar value out of the fish.
It's a feeling shared by fishermen and policy experts alike.
We can't go back to the old days where we took let's say we took a filet mignon from the ocean and turned it into hamburger meat, the block market or the mince market, right? Again, that served a purpose in the day. That model is not going to work today.
While this province has been out of the cod business, two neighboring countries have risen up in the global market, Norway and Iceland. Norway is the reigning king of cod, producing nearly 1 million metric tons per year. With that volume, Norway has cornered the market for cheap processed cod, the market Newfoundland and Labrador used to compete in. But if we can't beat Norway on price, many say we should follow Iceland instead and aim for quality.
They harvest at the right time of the year. They're bleeding and gutting on board their vessels, whether it's a small inshore boat or a large factory vessel.
With just 200,000 tons of cod per year, Iceland has oriented its fishery to produce a high-quality product that sells for a much higher price. But that's not all. By investing in technology, Iceland is finding uses for every part of the fish.
They have a strategy right now in Iceland over the next 5 years to get more value from the traditional waste stream than from the fillet. That's the kind of model we need to look at in terms of full utilization, maximizing value per kilo of catch. That's really the terminology that's key in this discussion.
But Watkins says there's another urgent discussion that needs to happen around the fishery.
It's too political. Our fishery is too political. The other countries that are successful, Iceland, Norway, they're not socialism. They don't have that social aspect in their fishery, and the politics is taken out of it. They're run as businesses, not as a political way to get elected or votes or to get people just to stay in the outports and use EI as a subsidy.
It's a sea change from the cod fishery of the past. Can it work? Brad Watkins believes it can, and he has a lot riding on it.
I've always had a passion that we can be more. We just need to pull together to be able to do it, to make it a proud industry in the province.
Zach Gowdy, CBC News, St. John's.
All right, guys, remember, when we're going through this relatively quickly, but if anybody has any questions at all, then use put your hand up at the participant button on your screen, and we'll certainly take it from there. Okay, I'm glad to answer any questions as we go through this. All right, so again, so we've talked about aggregates and fishing and oil and gas and coal. These are all sectors, of course, and now we're going to deal with forestry. And again, all the sectors we're talking about, these are all incredibly important in Canada and also incredibly important in Ontario. Ontario is a very rich province when it comes to resources. Forestry, again, is fundamentally a provincial jurisdiction. Again, the Father's Confederation, 153 years ago, basically said, hey, you know what? We want to keep natural resources within the province, and forestry is one of them. And this is a really big business because the use of timber, Canadian timber most particularly, is widely developed and shipped around the world. Right, there are issues with forestry when it affects Indigenous lands, right, and that's something that we'll deal with in a few seconds that we talked about on the class on Aboriginal rights. So again, it's a different bit of a lens to look at it when it comes to forestry in Canada. But overall, Canada is the leader in the world in softwood lumber and in newsprint. So, and those are two products that are used extensively around the world, right? Yeah, so they're used extensively around the world. I mean, everybody who builds a house, has lumber in it, that's softwood lumber, and newsprint. Now, newsprint, it's still a really big business, not as big as it used to be before social media, before people actually gathered their news, online. Whether it's a news channel like CTV or CBC, or it's Twitter or Facebook, getting your news from that source, which is online, isn't a use of newsprint. But before that, newspapers were the prime way to deliver news to the public, basically. Policies affecting the forestry have shifted from maximizing wood fiber products, wood fiber again being softwood lumber and newsprint, to now including an ecosystem of management, which essentially means that when forests are removed for the purposes of resource extraction, they're replaced. Right? And this is incredibly important. It's important for forest companies like McMillan Bloedel, these very large forest companies, to basically refurbish the environment with resources that they take from the environment. Right? The reason that it's incredibly important for Indigenous peoples is that, as you can imagine, the vast majority of territory in this country are treaty lands. Are basically lands that were negotiated with a First Nation to become crown lands, and then with the exception of the reserves, which were basically set aside for the possession of Indigenous peoples, but those crown lands, formerly treaty lands, that's where the trees are found. And Indigenous peoples, when they enter into treaties that create these crown lands, they still maintain their rights to the use and protection of the resources on those. All right, so if, for instance, Noront resource, when it comes to mining, or McMillan Bloedel when it comes to forestry, when they come onto any lands, or they intend to come onto any lands for resource extraction, right, they have the duty to consult and accommodate. We talked about this last day. which is now constitutionalized under Section 35 of the Constitution as a right, a constitutional right, right? And that was confirmed by both Haida Nation and Chilcotin Nation. Those are the two cases we referenced a couple of weeks ago, right? So, you know, it's incredibly important that before any resource company goes on to lands that are affected by a treaty, that in fact they consult and do whatever they can to accommodate the extraction that they're going to take of resources on those lands. And the way they do that, right, and I mentioned this earlier, is by way of impact benefit agreements. All right, so those are the contracts that are entered into by the resource companies with the First Nations that basically says that you agree that we will in fact be on these lands to basically extract these resources. In return for that, there will be profit sharing. There will be the first right for construction for First Nations to in fact work these lands, work this development with us. You know, there will be, you know, ongoing benefits for educational bursaries. All those kind of things that are in IBAs are there for the purposes of environmental protection, essentially, and economic advantage to the First Nations. Okay, agriculture, you know, Canada was fundamentally an agricultural nation long before it became any kind of a manufacturing entity. Great swaths of Canada are still fundamentally agricultural. Manitoba, Saskatchewan, a good part of Quebec, Maritimes, British Columbia, a chunk of Ontario, you know, pretty much all parts of the country still have a very substantial base in agriculture. The responsibility to ensure that agriculture is done in an efficient way that, again, doesn't harm the environment is both a federal and provincial responsibility, depending upon the extent of the farming that takes place. Intensive farming very much comes under the purview of government regulation. This is where you have, you know, for instance, farming includes, for instance, livestock, right? So you have intensive hog farms or cattle farms, chicken, you know, what have you, all of these that are basically high intensity livestock use for the purposes of, for the most part, food. Right, so they're very highly highly regulated. You also, of course, when it comes to farming, when it comes to protecting crops and you know, trying to keep down pesticides and what have you, you have, you know, rules that have given rise to the kinds of pesticides that could be used and the harm they can cause. Over the years, certain kinds of pesticides have been banned as being far too harmful in the long term to human consumption. Right, so that, you know, there's a lot of that happened in the 1980s and 90s. The regulation of agriculture also includes things like genetically modified organisms, GMOs. Right, so most of you have probably heard about this. So GMOs have been seen as both good and bad. We're going to watch a short video on this in a second. But for instance, we've created by way of a GMO a very hardy brand of wheat that's grown in the prairie. I want primarily that it's hardy in that it can grow in a longer season that is traditional in the cold climates that, you know, take hold in the sector in the prairies. So it can grow for a longer season, which obviously means you can grow more of it over a period of time, and that's GMO modified wheat, and there isn't any bread products, wheat products that we use in Canada today that isn't in some regard genetically modified. If it's labeled as organic, that's a relatively recent phenomenon for wheat. It means that somehow or other they got a hold of wheat seeds that hadn't been modified in the past, and that would have been a pretty difficult kind of thing. But there is obviously organic wheat available. So let's watch this video on GMOs.
GMOs are one of the most controversial areas of science. Genetic engineering is used in many fields, but even though medical applications like GM insulin are widely accepted, the debate heats up when it comes to food and agriculture. Why is that? Why is the same thing treated so differently? Let's try to get to the bottom of this and explore the facts, the fears, and the future of GMOs. Humans have been genetically modifying plants and animals for thousands of years. Maybe a few of your crops had very good yields, maybe one of your wolves was especially loyal. So you did the smart thing and bred the plants and animals that had traits beneficial to you. Traits are just an expression of genes. So with each generation, those genes got more pronounced. After thousands of years, almost every single plant and animal around us is vastly different from its pre-domesticated state. If humans have been changing genes for millennia, what makes a so-called genetically modified organism, or GMO, different? Selective breeding is basically hoping for lucky hits. Genetic engineering eliminates this factor. We can choose the traits we want, make fruit grow bigger, immune to pests, and so on. So why are people concerned about them? Let's start with one of the most common objections to GMOs. Gene flow, meaning GM crops could mix with traditional crops and introduce unwanted new characteristics into them. There is a method that might guarantee complete prevention, but is a big anti-GMO argument by itself: Terminator seeds. The idea is that they could produce sterile plants, requiring farmers to buy new seeds every year. The very concept of this, however, caused a public outcry, stopping the technology being put to use. This brings us back to the unintentional spreading of engineered DNA. There have been cases of GMOs growing where they weren't planted and traces of modified genes found in foreign crops. But GM plants can't run wild entirely. Many crops pollinate themselves, and all crops have to be related to mingle. There are also cultural methods like buffer zones to keep unintentional crossing at a minimum. But if it's possible in principle that a GMO could unintentionally cross with a non-GMO, there's actually a more important question. Is food that comes from GM crops different to food from non-GM crops? This question has been a major concern from the very beginning. GM plants that are destined to be eaten are checked for possible dangers, and the results are evaluated by multiple agencies. After more than 30 years and thousands of studies, the science is in. Eating GMO plants is no more risky than their non-GMO equivalent. But don't just take our word for it. Sources for this and other claims are in the video description. But what about plants that have been engineered to be toxic? For example, Bt crops. A gene borrowed from the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis lets engineered plants produce a protein that destroys the digestive system of specific insect pests. The plant makes its own pesticide. Insects that eat it die. That sounds alarming. Pesticide sprays can be washed off, while the poison in Bt crops is inside the plant. But actually, it's not a big deal. Poison is really just a question of different perspectives. What's harmless to one species might kill another. Coffee, for example, is a poison that kills insects but is harmless to us. Or take chocolate. It's dangerous for dogs, but a pleasure for humans. Bt crops produce a protein that is tailored to the specific design of the digestive tract of certain insects. It's completely harmless for us. There's also the opposite approach. Plants that are engineered to be resistant to certain weed killers. This way, farmers can use them widely, killing the other plants competing for resources without harming the crop. Here we get to the dark underbelly of GMOs. For the pesticide industry, they are big business. Over 90% of all cash crops in the US are herbicide resistant, mostly to glyphosate. As a result, the use of glyphosate has increased greatly. That isn't only bad. Glyphosate is much less harmful to humans than many other herbicides. Still, this means farmers have a strong incentive to rely on this one method only, casting more balanced ways of managing weeds aside. That's one of the most fundamental problems with the GMO debate. Much of the criticism of this technology is actually criticism of modern agriculture and the business practice of the huge corporations that control our food supply. This criticism is not only valid, it's also important. We need to change agriculture to a more sustainable model. GMOs as a technology are actually an ally and not an enemy in that fight, helping to save and protect nature and minimize our impact on the environment. Let's look at some positive examples. Eggplant is an important crop in Bangladesh, but often whole harvests are destroyed by pests. Farmers had to rely heavily on pesticides. Not only was this very expensive, farmers also frequently got sick. The introduction of a new GM eggplant in 2013 stopped this. The same Bt protein we talked about before, an effective killer of insects but harmless to humans, was engineered into them. This reduced insecticide use on eggplants by more than 80%. The health of farmers improves and their income rose dramatically. And sometimes a GM approach is the only option. In the 1990s, the papaya industry in Hawaii was under attack from the ring spot virus, which threatened to wipe out Hawaiian papaya. The solution was a papaya genetically modified to be vaccinated against the virus. Without it, the state's papaya industry would have collapsed. All these stories show a very narrow application. 99% of all GMOs we use right now produce pesticides or are resistant against them. There is so much more we could do. Scientists are working on GMOs that could improve our diet. Plants that produce more or different nutrients, like fruit with higher antioxidant levels that help to fight diseases, or rice with additional vitamins. On a larger scale, we're trying to engineer plants that are more resilient to climate change. Plants that can better adapt to erratic weather and adverse soil conditions, making them resistant to droughts or floods. GMOs could also not only reduce agriculture's impact on the environment, but actively help to protect it. Scientists are working on crops that can draw nitrogen from the air like microbes. Nitrogen is a common fertilizer, but its buildup pollutes the groundwater and speeds up climate change. Plants that collect their own nitrogen could fix two problems at once: the overuse of fertilizers in the developed world, as well as the shortage of it in developing countries. We could even modify plants to become super effective carbon collectors like the American chestnut tree, to mitigate and actually reverse climate change. With the tools we have today, our imagination is the limit. The world eats 11 million pounds of food every day. A UN estimate suggests we'll need 70% more by 2050. We could grow that food by clearing more and more forests to create fields and pastures, and by using more pesticides. Or we find a way to do it on the land we've got right now with more effective methods like GM crops. Intensifying farming instead of expanding it means GMOs could become the new organic. In a nutshell, GMOs have the potential to not only drastically change agriculture, but to also dampen the effects of our own irresponsible behavior. GMOs could be our most powerful weapon to save our biosphere. This video took more than 600 hours to make, which would be impossible without viewer support on patreon.com. If you'd like to support carefully researched content.
Okay, before we move off that, I mean, that's obviously been produced by a firm that's in favor of GMOs. I mean, and it's hard to tell that when you look to find which ones to show you. I did that for real purpose, for a real reason, and the reason is that I just want you to think about what they had to say. 99% of all GMOs when it comes to crops is used for either resisting pesticides or embedding pesticides in the plant's DNA. So, I kind of have a problem with thinking about food that I eat has a pesticide built into it, right? So there's no question that it's going to be ingested. So anyway, the whole idea of that is to make you think about it. And we're going to have one other short video in a couple of minutes that again deals with genetic modifications with respect to animals. So that's coming up in a second or so. Okay, the next sector is basically aquaculture, which is basically agriculture in the water. So it's the farming of species in the water, obviously for the most part fish, but it could also be lobsters and crab, other kinds of water-bearing species. Basically, the idea behind it, of course, is that it has to be done in a controlled environment so that it doesn't deplete stock. It has to be done so that whatever is being raised, again, there's going to be genetic modification in this to a great degree, is being done safely, and that biodiversity is respected, certainly with respect to any harmful environmental effects that the aquaculture may give rise to, basically. To a great degree, the federal government has jurisdiction over this because it's tied in very much with fisheries and oceans. So again, that's a federal responsibility, right? And it's important to keep this in mind because, you know, this is another way of intensive farming to raise income. All right. Lastly, we're dealing with pesticides. Pesticides, and again, you saw that with the GMOs for crops. They're used, you know, to a great degree to keep down, obviously, pests that harmfully impact crops and forests and what have you, basically. In the 1960s, a great deal of these pesticides were considered to be what are called POPs, persistent organic pollutants, and in fact became banned in many countries, including Canada. So there was a pesticide it's DT something. I apologize, I don't have the name with me. That was used for everywhere with respect to plant growth, and it was found to be incredibly harmful. And as a function of that, was banned and still is banned, basically. Canada's approach to pesticides has likewise, you know, because it's such a broad-ranging issue, is dealt with by way of international law. Again, the precautionary principle is at play. So we've talked about this a couple times in this class. The precautionary principle, again, is notwithstanding the fact that we may not yet have a fixed scientific basis for doing something, we're going to do it anyway in anticipation that we will be putting in place some kind of provision to protect the environment in the future. So that's the principle with respect to pesticides. So, you know, they may not, whoever the scientific body is that's looking into them, may not know what a certain pesticide may or may not do in the future. If they think that it may have some prospective possibility of harm, they will ban it, you know, before the science, you know, has given that kind of conclusion beforehand. All right. If somebody's going to use a pesticide or get it approved for sale, it must be registered through Health Canada and must pass all the regulations put in place by the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. Provinces and territories can also regulate pesticide use, and they do that, of course, obviously with respect to approving those that can be used on farms for the most part, basically. And importantly, municipalities have a role to play with respect to pesticide use. And this, you got to remember that, you know, that municipalities don't have a separate constitutional sphere of authority in our Constitution. It's either the federal government or the provinces and territories. But again, municipalities are part of the provincial scheme of governance. And so, you know, as long as the provincial government has authority over what the municipalities want to do, then chances are highly likely that municipalities will be able to continue with the province's approval. And that's what's happened. For the most part, when we talk about pesticides within the municipal sphere of things, you know, for instance, bylaws that the city of Sault Ste. Marie may put in place, property standard bylaws or what have you, would do, for instance, you know, most commonly were things like pesticides for use on lawns and gardens, right? That's the kind of thing that is really, really local and something that the city of Sault Ste. Marie can deal with because it has bylaw officers working for the city that can go out very easily and check on the use of pesticides being sprayed on lawns and what have you. So that's legitimate municipal protection for the environment. And lastly, again, we're going back to genetic modifications. We're dealing with now, for the most part, genetic engineering when it comes to what I refer to as animal life, right? So this is really important because, you know, there are a number of ways that we have over the course of time genetically modified food, as in living food, animal food, for various reasons. More often than not, however, to make the food more, the food base being pigs and cattle and what have you, make them more resistant to anything that would harm them in the normal course of events. So they're injected with steroids, they're injected with all kinds of things that makes them healthier. And there's a lot of modifications that use genetic modifications to make them grow bigger and faster, right? And that obviously for pork And for beef, that's exactly what you're going to want to do if you're a pork or beef farmer. You make your income from the magnitude of meat you can manufacture. But having said that, there is a lot of things that genetic modifications in animals does beyond the manufacture of things that are eaten. So this is our last video that we're going to watch, and then we'll do the breakout sessions.
18 genetically modified organisms you didn't know about. 18. Featherless chicken. Israeli scientists have created this strange animal, a chicken without any feathers. The weird-looking animal is supposedly much cheaper to raise, more environmentally friendly, and doesn't require any feather plucking, which, in general, saves resources. This naked chicken can literally go straight from farm to fridge without much work. While this seems like a great idea, there are still some hurdles to cross, such as the fact that, without feathers, chickens cannot protect themselves from harsh weather and parasites. 17. Glittering gold seahorses. Vietnam-based scientists have created a breed of seahorse that is literally worth its weight in gold. Scientists took the fluorescent gene from a jellyfish and inserted it into a tiny grain of gold, which was then injected into the eggs of a seahorse. This glittering gene was absorbed into the cells of the seahorse, and they grew into glittery seahorses that shine in the light. While it seems like a lucrative venture to sell glittery pet fish, the scientists were testing out a technique to replace negative genes with good genes in humans and livestock. 16. Singing mouse. While we usually genetically modify animals and conduct experiments with a direct purpose, the Evolved Mouse Project doesn't really do that. Instead, they add sort of random genes to mice, let them breed, and see what happens. That's how, after mixing mice genes with bird genes, we got singing mice. Baby mice were found inherently to know how to sing from a young age. When other non-genetically modified mice grew up around the singing mice, they actually learned how to make similar sing-song chirpy noises themselves. 15. Glowfish. There is a pet fish whose DNA is patented and trademarked, and that fish is the glowfish. They are genetically modified zebra daniofish that were crossed with the fluorescent proteins of a jellyfish to create funfish that glow different neon colors. Other glowfish were created by splicing the zebra danio with sea coral and other jellyfish genes. You can own your very own GMO fish in most parts of the United States, except for California. 14. Spare part pigs. It's pretty common now to use the heart valves from pigs to transplant into human hearts. But now, we can develop pigs that we could take the entire organs from for human transplants. These pigs are used for spare parts and have been designed so that their hearts, livers, kidneys, pancreases, and other organs can be taken whole to be put into humans without our body's immune system rejecting it. 13. Fast-growing salmon. When it comes to sustainable food sources, we usually look towards domesticated animals and plants that we can farm and breed. Salmon is sometimes farmed, but they take a little while to reach maturity. That is, until Aqua Bounty genetically modified the Atlantic salmon with Chinook salmon and a bottom-dwelling eelfish to create a salmon that grows twice as fast and twice as big. 12. Male tilapia. Over the last few years, we have genetically modified tilapia to help them mature faster and grow larger with fewer resources. This would be taken a step further with making sure that more male tilapias are born than female ones. Female tilapia breed by holding eggs in their mouth. During this time, they won't eat anything, which means they end up being smaller. Tilapia farmers prefer bigger fish and thus would rather have more male tilapia than female ones in their farms. 11. Sudden death mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are one of the biggest proliferators of malaria, resulting in 1 million deaths and infecting more than 300 million people every year. Scientists began engineering special mosquitoes to combat this by creating mosquitoes that resist the parasite that passes malaria, effectively killing off all mosquitoes. Scientists began engineering special mosquitoes to combat this by creating mosquitoes that resist the parasite that passes malaria and other mosquitoes who would die before reaching sexual maturity, effectively killing off all mosquitoes. The resistant mosquitoes, however, wouldn't be able to resist quickly evolving parasites and the sudden death ones would risk affecting the entire ecosystem that relies on eating mosquitoes. So, these GMOs are restrained to the labs they were made in. 10. Glow-in-the-dark cats. Cats are made vulnerable to a virus that is closely related to HIV called feline immunodeficiency virus. It's a virus that affects feral cats pretty frequently, and there are 500 million cats in the world. In 2011, Japanese and US-based scientists inserted a gene into cats to help them resist feline AIDS, and to make sure that gene was easily visible to the scientists. In 2011, Japanese and US-based scientists inserted a gene into cats to help them resist feline AIDS, and to make sure the gene was easily visible to the scientists, they added a gene that made the cats glow in the dark. So, there are a bunch of super mutant cats out there with disease immunities and the ability to emit a green glow from their skin. 9. The ripest and juiciest strawberries you got from the supermarket might contain the genetic traces of a fish. Scientists have been experimenting with combining strawberries with the antifreeze genes that are found in cold water fish like Arctic char and sea flounders, which help the strawberries resist freezing and dying in bad weather. Luckily, it doesn't create a weird fishy tasting strawberry. 8. Glow-in-the-dark rabbit. Most genetically modified organisms have a specific purpose in mind or a greater goal that usually justifies messing with something's DNA spread. Most genetically modified organisms have a scientific purpose in mind or a greater goal that usually justifies messing with something's DNA spread. However, Edward Keck used genetic engineering for creating works of art rather than for scientific research. His most notorious work was the glow-in-the-dark rabbit named Alba. It sparked a debate about animal rights, but Alba died before anything was resolved. 7. Goats spliced with spiders. When you think of genetically splicing something with a spider, you usually think of superheroes with spider-themed superpowers. However, in real life, you can find animals that have been genetically combined with spiders. Goats. Spider silk is flexible and strong, and some even want to try and produce it on a larger scale so we can use it to make things like parachute cords. One lab has spliced spider genes with a goat, so that these flexible and strong spider silk genes would be replicated in their milk. This silk milk is also able to create biosteel, a strong web-like material. 6. Golden rice. Rice is a major staple food in many parts of the world, partly because it's cheap and partly because it helps you feel full even when you don't have much to eat. However, the normal white rice isn't very healthy for you. That is why scientists are working on golden rice, rice that was spliced with vegetables like squash and carrots that not only create the golden color, but also include beta-carotene, which is more nutrient-dense and could help prevent blindness in children who eat it. 5. Ear mouse. The most notorious genetically modified animal might be the ear mouse, or the vacanty mouse, which was created in 1995 by scientists in Massachusetts. The scientists wanted to prove that cartilage structures could be grown on other living creatures before being removed and transplanted into humans who need it. However, this mouse would quickly become famous or infamous as it went on to the Jay Leno show, and then used as a mascot by animal rights groups who are opposed to genetic modifications. 4. Scorpion cabbage. The Androctonus australis is one of the most dangerous scorpions in the world, with a venom that can cause tissue damage and death. So, of course, we combine the genes from this scorpion with cabbage, intended for human consumption. The gene of the scorpion's venom changed when it was spliced with the cabbage. The venom is now only poison to insects, which spasm and die when they try to eat the crop. The same poison is supposedly completely harmless to humans, making it the perfect crop. 3. Anti-cancer purple tomatoes. Researchers have also created a tomato that is not only more flavorful, but would also help prevent cancer. The researchers spliced tomatoes with a snapdragon flower to create a deep purple tomato that almost looks like a blackberry. These super tomatoes contain potent antioxidants and inhibit the growth of cancer cells, ease the symptoms of diabetes, and even relieve the pains of growing old. You might just see purple tomatoes on your pizza someday soon. 2. Chinese dog pig. This image went around the internet with a bunch of people thinking it was some sort of failed chimera of a pig and a dog because of its pink skin and strange tufts of hair. While it was not an animal that was genetically engineered in a lab, it is an animal that has been genetically engineered over generations. This dog, in particular, is the hairless Chinese crested dog, an expensive and rare breed of dog that is highly sought after by some people, even though the winner of the annual World's Ugliest Dog contest is usually a Chinese crested. 1. Less flatulent cows. You might have heard that cows produce an excess of methane, which contributes to the dangerous greenhouse effect. It's hard to make cows stop producing methane, since they're some of the most populous domestic livestock in the world, and that it's a natural part of their digestive progress. Until we genetically modified cattle to produce 25% less of the bacterium in their digestive tract that creates methane gas. Basically, we made cows fart less.
All right, guys, that's it. Does anybody have any questions before we move into the breakout sessions? All right, we're good. All right, so those are the sectors. So next class, we'll be dealing with the, again, the control toolbox of environmental regulations, and that will be environmental assessments, which are incredibly important part of that process. All right, so I'm going to put everybody in, again, as you already know, into 5 breakout rooms. Your breakout session number 1 or room number 1 will do question number 1 all the way through to 5. Okay, and again, 20 minutes seems to be the way things are working. So I'll leave you for 20 minutes and then come back and we'll discuss your questions. All right,